morning. Today is the day we finally begin the second book in Isaiah's grand vision, the Book of the Servant. We have completed the Book of the King, which focused on the judgment of God's people for their unfaithfulness, while also being infused with the hope that God would not abandon them because He still had a plan for them and would be faithful to His covenant. If you glance back at the timeline on page 359 of your study guide, you will recall that the Book of the King was set in Judah, with the ever-looming threat of Assyria, the superpower of Isaiah's day, hanging over them. As we studied last week, God miraculously spared Judah from destruction by Assyria under King Hezekiah. However, true to God's revelation in chapter 39, Judah would eventually be conquered by Babylon in 606 BC, and many of its inhabitants would be taken into exile by 586 BC. As we open to the Book of the Servant in Isaiah 40 today, we need to appreciate that Isaiah is speaking to a people in his future. According to your timeline, Isaiah died in 681. So he is speaking to those in Babylonian exile almost 100 years or even more than that after his death. God has given him a message to those who would themselves utterly be stripped of all that is familiar and thus would be tempted to feel abandoned by God. We need to remember Isaiah's central theological purpose for his own hearers, which is to look beyond the coming judgment to encourage faith in the unchanging promises and purposes of God for His people. He wants those who read the prophecy to be assured of the dependability of God's steadfast word, so that whether they are in Judah or Babylon, they will learn to trust His promises and so obey His commands. In this way, Isaiah purposed together a faithful remnant in his own and succeeding generations, in which present obedience or godliness is motivated by a sure and certain future hope. Our own generation is certainly no exception to this need, quoting Jackman. Melody, the opening words almost catch us off guard by the tenderness and beauty for those suffering in exile.
Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Double comfort is tenderly spoken over these Hebrew exiles in Babylon. But what can and shall bring them comfort? God's trustworthiness does not end because of their disobedience. Rather, God Himself has provided the pardon for their sins. Verse 2. The unmerited grace of God shall bring His people comfort, regardless of their circumstances. Yet another voice cries out in verse 3, prepare the way of the Lord. The people cannot help themselves, so God Himself must come. Now that the King is coming, the one thing people are to do is prepare the way. We might say today, roll out the red carpet. And when the King arrives, His glory shall be revealed, meaning His presence will be fully known, and all flesh shall see it together. This indicates that there will be an ultimate day when all flesh will behold the glory of the Lord. To make sure we are assured of this fact, the voice adds, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Count on it, He will come in glory. The voice's cries continue in verse 6. All flesh is grass, referring to the transience of our earthly lives. We are finite creatures, and the power of life and death are in the breath or the Spirit of the Lord. This alludes to Genesis 2:7, where God breathed life into the first human. Contrasted to the fragility of humanity is the striking permanence of the Word of God. So although we cannot stand before God in our own weakness, on our own, His Word says He will provide a way. Because of this wonderful reassuring news, the Lord is coming to reign, and we can trust Him because of the indestructible power of His Word. What is to be the response? This wonderful news needs to be shouted from the mountain, verse 9, so everyone can hear. And Zion is to be the chosen herald. Fear not, behold your God. Behold as in look, here he comes, anticipating the fulfillment of the promise. Verse 10, he comes in might with his arm raised, and his reward is his flock before him. Now notice that his raised arm in verse 10 is lowered in verse 11 to gather and carry his lambs. The mighty God is also the good shepherd. The incomparable nature of Creator God is highlighted with a series of rhetorical questions, beginning in verse 12. Remarking on the precision and scope of God's creative acts and the easy competence with which he has created all things. After all, the waters fit in the hollow of his hand, and he can easily weigh the mountains on his scale. The questions keep coming, much like they do in Job's encounter with God. Verses 13 and 14 make plain that God did this without help or advice from anyone else. In Babylonian myth, Marduk, their creator god, could not proceed with creation without consulting another god, E, the all-wise. Israel's God needs no other counsel. He is the first cause of all things. So the nations who seem so mighty to little Israel are actually like a drop from a bucket to God. Verse 15. Lebanon, which was known for its great forests, does not have enough fuel or animals to properly worship God. It's not that people and nations are worthless, it's just that they are so small and helpless in comparison to God. Julia, the questions keep on coming. To what is God, the holy transcendent one, being compared in verses 18 to 20?
Verse 19 very sarcastically exclaims, an idol. As in, seriously, folks? Then the author gives a play-by-play of idol making. First, it's cast in iron, then overlaid with gold, then decorated with silver chains. The best wood will be chosen with the most skilled craftsmen working extra hard to make sure the thing doesn't fall over. Isaiah is dramatically showing how very foolish it is to try to fashion a god out of earthly materials. Oswalt says it this way, shall the God who made the world without an advisor be represented by a skilled technician that cannot even assure that it can stand up? Hardly. Verse 21, do you not know? Do you not hear? Hello. Verse 22, it is the Lord who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. These verses are stressing God's transcendence or otherness and the comparative smallness of humanity. There is none like him. He stretches the heavens like a curtain. The word here is gossamer, which is a translucent curtain made out of spider webs. The awesome heavens are to the true God as cobwebs that he can easily break through at any time. Further, verse 23, he brings the rulers of the earth to nothing. Again, it's not to say rulers and people are worthless. They just cannot compare to God, who is wholly other and greater. Verse 24, once again, speaks of the transience of human beings upon the earth. The rulers are compared to grape seedlings, which the hot wind will carry off, here today, gone tomorrow. In verse 25, the Holy One speaks for himself. Is there anyone else you would like to compare me to? Have you run out of ideas yet? Lift up your eyes and see who created these. Look up. Like many ancient peoples, the Babylonians worshiped deities that were represented by the stars. But the stars were created by God. He brings out their hosts by number, calling them all by name. As we've said, hosts can mean stars or angels. It is actually a military term for armies. Here it is as if the general has assembled his troops, calling them by name. Not one is missing. Melody, God has made a powerful case for himself, but the people don't seem fully convinced yet, do they?
No. God knows their hearts. And in verse 27, they say, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God. This is the recurrent complaint throughout all generations. Why doesn't God do something about my situation? The first mistake is theological, that my way is hidden from God. God has made it quite clear nothing and no one is hidden from him. Secondly, they mistake the character of God, that he doesn't want to help. Is he unable or unwilling to act on their behalf? The response is the beloved passage in verses 28 to 31. But isn't it powerful to see this in context? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. Answer, he is able. And now we read, he is willing. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Verse 29. Even those in the prime of their lives are limited and need God's strength. How is this strength accessed? By first acknowledging our lack and his resource. He's God, and we certainly are not. Then wait upon him. Biblical waiting is confident expectation. We must acknowledge our complete dependence upon God and be willing to allow him to dictate the timing and terms of his strength. It may and probably will look different from what we expect. But just like an eagle, we can learn to stretch out our wings to catch his wind or breath, spirit. His strength is what will carry us forward. Sometimes we soar, sometimes we run, and sometimes we merely walk. But he will bring us forward according to his plan and purposes in his strength. Julia, next we turn to chapter 41, where the first of a number of court scenes in this book ensues. What's happening here?
Well, all people, indicated by the term coastlands, are to draw near in silence. Coastlands could be understood as the ends of the earth. So everyone is to come and listen, and then they will get an opportunity to speak. However, God is the judge, jury, and prosecutor. He will present the case and decide the verdict. The issue before them is, where does authority and rule truly lie in world events? In verses 2 through 4, he presents the evidence. There is an independent actor behind all of history. It is I, the Lord, the first, and with the last, I am he. In verse 2, he is stirring up one from the east who is to be victorious at every turn, who travels at such speed that his feet appear not to even touch the ground. We will come to know more specifics about this one, but the preview is that it is Cyrus the Great, the first king of the Persian Empire. So while the Israelites are currently in exile in Babylon, the promise is that another will arise who will swiftly conquer all the nations before him. And we are told that the Lord God is sovereignly behind these actions. What will be the nation's response to this force? Verse 5, the coastlands have seen and are afraid. But do they turn to the one who could have saved them? No. Verse 6, they turn to one another for false security, and then to the craftsman to forge another idol for them, this time reinforcing it with nails for good measure. The irony in verse 7 of the craftsman pronouncing the idol, "It is good," should send up red flags when we realize this is the same phrase back in Genesis 1, the pronouncement of the true God over his creation. It is good. Something is really wrong here with this human pronouncement over an idol. But in verse 8, a stark contrast is drawn between the response of the coastlands and Israel, my servant. Now remember, we are in the book of the servant, and this is the first reference to servant, so let's perk up and pay attention. Here the servant is Israel, whom God has chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend. In Genesis 12, God chose Abraham to leave Ur to follow him to an unknown land, and he made him this promise: "And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God made a covenant with Abraham that in him and his descendants all the earth would be blessed. And God, despite Israel's disobedience, God was still determined to follow through with his plan through Abraham's offspring. And as a people in exile, he assured them in verse 10, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." He is faithful to his covenant, regardless of the circumstances. So, Melody, what about all those who still wanted to do away with Israel?
They will perish. Verse 11. It is foolish to meddle with the servant of the Holy One of Israel. As God told Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. This is not an empty threat. It is the assurance that God's plans to bless all the world will be established. Verse 13. For I, the Lord your God, hold your right hand. It is I who say to you, fear not. I am the one who helps you. Oswalt says, where verse 10 speaks of God's right hand, in this verse, he will hold their right hand. Taken together, these two verses present a powerful picture of a parent and child. In the father's right hand is a mighty weapon to defeat an enemy, but in his left hand, he's holding the child's right hand. He does not merely stand by to defend, but he's also physically with the child, and he will not allow the child to be separated from him. Verse 14, fear not, you worm, Jacob. Now today we would receive being called a worm as a great insult, but that's not the intention here. It's the same idea as being called a grasshopper earlier. A worm is one hopelessly inadequate to any task of substance. But who does Almighty God come to help? I am the one who helps you, declares the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. No matter how small or powerless you may seem, if God is on your side, so is victory. The title Redeemer makes the first of 13 appearances in this book. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, Redeemer is a term used for a near relative that delivers a poor person from enslavement or loss of family inheritance. God is the only one in the unique position to be able to redeem his entire feeble people and the entire world for that matter. Verse 15, the worm is to become a threshing sledge that will be able to crush mountains. A threshing sledge was an agricultural tool made of a heavy wooden platform fitted underneath with sharp stones and pieces of cutting metal, which was dragged over the crop to chop the straw in preparation for winnowing. The tool was useful because of the master who operated it. The worm, God's chosen agent, will be victorious in the master's hand, and there will be rejoicing in the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. Julia, the promises continue for Israel.
Yes, in verses 17 through 20, we have a beautiful poetic summary of all that the Lord will do to restore Israel. The metaphor is drawn of a desert that becomes replete with water and prolific plant growth as God cares for his people. As always, God's care is especially directed to the poor and needy who are parched with thirst. Thirst is often a powerful symbol of human need, whether physical, material, or spiritual. Thirst is a picture of powerlessness to quench and dependence upon another to provide. He answers their prayers and provides abundantly. Verse 18, I will open rivers on the bare heights and fountains in the midst of valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land springs of water. This is a picture of God abundantly meeting every human need. God indeed is able to take that which is barren and hopeless and make it fertile and fruitful. Conversely, Oswalt reminds us, perhaps the greatest curse of well-being whether physical, material, emotional, or spiritual, is that it lures us into believing we are self-sufficient. It is when our neediness, in whatever realm, has taught us that the cosmic Lord on whom we depend absolutely longs to bless those who bring their needs to Him, that we have learned the greatest lesson of life. To those in Babylon, this text must have reminded them of the long ago deliverance of their ancestors from Egypt through the wilderness. God is now saying, I delivered my people before, providing them with water. I will do it again, even more abundantly. The desert, now filled with an abundance of water, becomes a massive forest filled with a multitude of varieties of trees. Why does He do this? Verse 20, that they may see and know, may consider and understand together that the hand of the Lord has done this. The Holy One of Israel has created it. This is firsthand experience. God provides for us daily so that we may see Him at work. And notice the phrase, that we may consider and understand together. His work is to be marveled at in community. We are to marvel and understand together. May this be what we are about today and every day we get together, to be in His Word.
That's certainly true for me personally, Julia. When we consider His Word together, it does bring greater understanding and wonder to me. Being in the Word was never meant to be a solitary endeavor. It's always been a communal undertaking for God's people. After all, for most of human history, most couldn't even read, nor did they have access to a personal copy of the Bible. We are so very blessed to live in an age to be able to read our own Bibles in our homes. However, that doesn't mean we should ever give up considering and understanding together. Let us marvel together at our Redeemer. Next week, we continue the beautiful Book of the Servant. Isaiah looks to the future day when judgment has passed and restoration is promised. However, God's ways continue to surprise as we learn more and more about His plans for restoration and more about the ultimate mysterious servant who has promised to come and set the world aright.